questions. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to also welcome our online audience, which at last count was 70 and climbing. So it is really a great pleasure for me, the Director of IEP, to welcome you all this afternoon. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis, and it is really a pleasure to welcome our dear partners, Education Development Trust, who are very pleased to be hosting for the launch of their report on Vietnam. So we want to encourage everyone to participate in a discussion following the presentation. So please keep in mind your comments and questions. And that goes for our online audience as well. You can enter your questions online, and we'll move to that. The other thing to mention is we have a hashtag, #CleverVietnam. So please do tweet and through Twitter, etc. So thank you. It is my pleasure I simply pass the baton to our moderator. So it's a pleasure to introduce to you Ug Musi, who is the head of research and development here at IEP. And with that, I will step out of the camera. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Sue said, we are delighted to participate in the launch and to host the launch of this report on Vietnam, Promising Practice, Government Schools in Vietnam. And probably you'll tell us a little bit more, because why you say promising practice and not whatever good practice or best practice. You explained that in the report. We all know that Vietnam for the past years has been kind of a model for a number in education for a number of developing countries, with great success and great achievements. And I think everybody was kind of expecting to see a little bit why, and to try to understand how and why it could happen. And this is really the objective of this report, to go into this kind of explanation through a qualitative approach, which I think learns a lot about the situation and what happened here. I'm not going to say more, but we have the pleasure now to, we're going to listen to Tony McAleavy, do I pronounce it well? Yeah. And Rachael Fitzpatrick, who will make the presentation, and then we'll go to a round of questions, both with the room and with our online audience. So you have the floor now.
Okay.
I will sit here for the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Sue, and thank you everybody for finding the time to join us this afternoon, both here in Paris and online. We're really grateful that you could find the time, and we're hugely grateful to our good friends IIEP for hosting this session. I was first in this building in Paris back in 2006 when we began then a really nice partnership, a research partnership, looking at effective practice in dealing with education in post-conflict situations. Education Development Trust in those days had a different name. We were called CFBT, but we're the same organization. So we're going to do a joint session, Rachael and I, talking you through our new report on Vietnam. Unfortunately, our third co-author, Dr. Tai Ha from the Vietnam Institute of Educational Science, wasn't able to make this session, but she's an important part of the partnership as her organization. So, as I said, IEP and UNESCO, IIEP and Education Development Trust have been partners for many years. And it would be remiss of me not to use this opportunity to promote another publication that we have produced jointly with IIP UNESCO. That is to say, our recent literature review to the experience of teachers of refugees. So we got some copies here of that report. If you're online, please do check that out on our websites. So why Vietnam? Well, here's an interesting graph which shows some Pisa data, Pisa Science 2015. And And on the bottom axis, you have GDP for the 70 countries that participated in Pisa. And on the left axis, you have not the usual score, the average score, but the percentage of students who achieved basic proficiency or above, what OECD Pisa call level 2 or above. And you will see that there's quite an interesting pattern here, because there's a little dot at the top left, which is the poorest country out of the 70, the country with the lowest GDP per capita, which got the best score. 94.1% of the Vietnamese children who participated in Pisa achieved level 2 or above in the science test. That was the best score in the world, and Vietnam was the poorest of the participating jurisdictions. So I think that's interesting. And of course, Pisa 2012, published in 2013, really alerted the world to the fact that maybe something interesting, something impressive was happening in Vietnam. Of course, it's hugely contested. Everything is hugely contested. And it's also complex. And people rightly point out, OECD Pisa rightly point out, that actually many students in Vietnam don't have access to upper secondary education. And that's really important that we bear that in mind when we're interpreting these figures. And of course, I accept that. Actually, there are several other countries on that chart that have relatively low enrollment at upper secondary that don't do anything near as well as Vietnam. But of course, the point is well made, that the PISA performance needs to be seen through that particular lens. But there is other data. So for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the beautiful Oxford University Young Lives study that looks at children from Vietnam, but also Peru and Ethiopia and India, and has been tracking them for many years. And actually the Young Lives colleagues, they drew attention to the Vietnamese performance before PISA. So before the publication of the 2013 results of 2012 PISA, Young Lives published their analysis of what was happening towards the end of primary school in Vietnam. So here is a quote from Dr. Joe Boyden, who is the director of Young Lives. Based on the assessment 2011-12 of grade 5 students, pupil performance in Vietnam is truly exceptional. Around 19 out of every 20 10-year-olds can add 4-digit numbers, 85% can subtract fractions, 81% are able to find X in a simple equation. Truly exceptional. So this is an independent source, and also a source that's not subject to that issue about upper secondary. So something interesting seems to be happening in Vietnam. Clearly, PISA it connects with this in terms of our interest. And we shared a copy of our report with Andreas Schleicher of OECD, who of course is responsible for PISA. And this is what he said about our report and the Vietnamese context, that Vietnam's PISA results have shown the world that quality and equity in education can rapidly improve. This report reveals what lies behind this success, not just in terms of the policies and practices that Vietnam has prioritized, but also by showing how these have been sequenced and successfully implemented. Obviously, we were delighted that Andres made these kind remarks. I think it's interesting that he's homed in on some issues to do with how the system works, because we've tried to shine a light on some aspects of how the system actually works in Vietnam. Hugh said, question mark, promising. What is this word promising? Promising practice. And of course, he's absolutely right in his suggestion there, that we are not making definitive causation claims based on our largely qualitative inquiry. We think the approach that we've taken has revealed some really rich data. But at the same time, we need to be very careful about the claims. So we've identified 5 promising features of the Vietnamese system. But we're saying they're promising rather than proven in terms of the causal relationships. And of course, we absolutely recognize that there are powerful factors beyond the school, beyond school effectiveness, that must surely be contributing to the Vietnam success story. Nevertheless, our view is that this is a promising, important story, and that policymakers worldwide should take note of the positive features of what appears to be a particularly effective basic education system. Okay, so we're going to look at the system, but we recognize the factors that are, if you like, outside the schools, that this cannot be explained purely in terms of school effectiveness. And one, I think, manifestly a relevant factor is the role of culture. And we have here a couple of quotations from our interviewees who, of course, pointed out the significance of an aspirational pro-education culture amongst many parents in Vietnam. The second quote is actually an answer to the question to a teacher, why do you think Vietnam did so well in Pisa? And with typical modesty, the teacher didn't say, because we have great teachers in Vietnam. The teacher said, first, it's about a learning tradition. All right. First of all, it's a question of the Vietnamese culture. So for sure, culture is powerful, and we're focusing on the mechanics of the system, but we recognize the significance of culture. And then in the title, I've also put in parentheses, and private tutoring ? So this has not been a focus for our study, but there is no doubt that private tutoring is very, very prevalent in Vietnam. And we haven't attempted to measure the impact of private tuition. It would be quite wrong to be talking about the Vietnamese context without recognizing that there is another factor at play in terms of the effects of. There's an answer there from a head teacher in Hanoi to a question, do your students, do they get private tuition? The head teacher plays the question back, do our students attend extra tuition? Sure. As you know, extra private tuition is the reasonable demand of their family and students themselves, so they attend extra private tuition. As if it was a stupid question. Of course, many of them are accessing private tutors. So we've not looked at that. But it's clearly an interesting and relevant factor. Okay, so Rachael, tell us a little bit about our methodology.
Okay, so I'll briefly talk you all through how we went about investigating this topic. So we talked to stakeholders in 4 contrasting provinces. So we spoke to parents, teachers, principals, pedagogical colleges, those who teach teaching methods, and also local officials at provincial and district level. In addition to national individuals at the ministry level. So in terms of the provinces, we selected these of our Vietnamese partners to show very different contexts of schooling. So the first one, so the image is behind me, this is Ha Giang. It's predominantly ethnic minority groups who live in this particular province. There are many languages spoken among these groups. It's important to note that the Vietnamese education system, the language of instruction is Vietnamese. So ethnic minority groups are at a disadvantage when they begin school because they don't speak the language of instruction. So that's why we wanted to select a province that had a multitude of languages, and also many classrooms are multi-grade classrooms too. So they have lots of different ages in one classroom. And as you can imagine, that's because it's particularly rural and mountainous. So getting to and from school can be difficult for these groups. The second province was Binh Dinh. So this is west, south, central. As you can see from the photographs from a news article in 2016, every year it's subject to flooding and storms. And these are some images of teachers hair drying textbooks and trying to salvage furniture. So again, we picked this one because it has another set of factors that barriers to learning for a lot of children because schools closing at different points of the year as a result of storms. And then finally, we looked in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. So this is Ho Chi Minh City, but it could easily be Hanoi. very metropolitan, really large populations, and the majority of the population are the Kin ethnic majority group. So they speak Vietnamese as a first language. So education's, again, it's a different context that we're looking at. So we worked with the Vietnam Institute of Educational Sciences to conduct our research. And one of the co-authors of the report, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, Dr. Tai Ha, she led this team. And it was very much partnership working throughout the process of investigating this topic. So very briefly, I'll take you through how we did it. So a core part was policy analysis. And we did this by looking at policies in a big sequence thematically. So what kind of policies keep recurring over the past 10, 15 years in Vietnam, and also looking at policies in depth for a kind of content analysis of those policies. As I mentioned, we did the fieldwork in the provinces. We commissioned Ipsos Vietnam to do a survey with parents. So we got 350 parents across the 4 provinces. And we also did second rounds of fieldwork as well to investigate further into the topics we identified in our first round. And as you'll see, at 3 points through this investigation, we consulted with education experts in Vietnam. So every time we got data back and we'd done a stage of analysis, we then went and we consulted along with the Vietnamese Institute of Educational Sciences, experts in different areas, such as ethnic minority groups, primary education, a variety of experts, just to make sure we were going along the right lines of our analysis. And finally, we decided to look at the survey data in Pisa, the student survey and the school principal survey. We didn't do this at the beginning because we didn't want it to influence what we were looking at, but we thought perhaps it would reinforce some of the points in our analysis, and it did. And you'll see when you read the report that we do reference it a lot throughout the report in addition to our data. So it's very much we've integrated the two. And Tony will also be talking through some PISA data when we get into the core findings. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So we've organized the report around these 5 dimensions of the system to do with the policy, to do with the role of accountability in the Vietnamese government school, issues to do with the teacher workforce, questions of school leadership, and finally the role of parents and parental partnership. So those are our 5 promising practices. And we look at each one separately, but also we comment, of course, on the fact that it all connects. So let me tell you a little bit about those themes. In terms of national policy making, many of you will know this is not a particularly original discovery, so to speak, that there's been a sustained emphasis over time in Vietnam, a twin track approach, emphasize improve both enrollment and a series of quality issues. And I don't know whether you can see this particular slide, but it describes the progress so far in terms of enrollment. So Vietnam has made lots of progress since the early 1990s in terms of enrolling students. The Vietnamese colleagues are typically very diffident and modest about all of their achievements. And they will say there is still much to be done. So although there's been really dramatic progress, for example, in upper secondary, it is still the case, and I mentioned this in the context of PISA, that many students don't have access to upper secondary. There are other issues to do with the fact that a lot of students still only have access to a half-day shift of schooling. So there's still much to be done. Nonetheless, a huge achievement since the 1990s. In terms of the quality issues, as Rachel said, we've tracked the policy documents, and what you see there is a sustained, I call it here, consistent and persistent story in terms of the policy emphasis, and in effect, a theory of change about what needed to be done, as well as getting the children into school. So, for example, a big push over many years on preschool, and ensuring that almost all children get at least 1 year of preschool in a public kindergarten in order to enhance the school readiness of the children. A big push consistently really since the late 1990s on creating a national debate almost with the teaching force about more engaging pedagogy, the need for more engaging pedagogical techniques in the classroom. An emphasis on improving the pre-service requirements for teachers at all levels of the school system and indeed the preschool system. And consistently, as a sort of default setting, a question about what the policies mean, what almost every policy means in terms of the gap that there has been historically in terms of opportunities and outcomes between different geographical areas in Vietnam and between the Kin majority and some of the Vietnamese people who come from other ethnic minority groups. So Rachel's going to say a little bit about the ethnic minority policy making.
So as Tony mentioned, there is still a gap that exists between the Kin majority group in academic performance compared to ethnic minority groups. And although we didn't go into the causality of this, it's likely a number of factors, some cultural with higher dropout rates, but also language being an issue. But the Vietnamese government are acutely aware of this, and they have consistent and persistent policies that target both access and quality at the same time. So it's not just a case of wanting to get children into school, it's a case of as soon as they're in school, they need to have a high quality education to close this gap. And in terms of how they're improving access, so they offer financial support to ethnic minority groups to attend school. There's a rice allowance, so school meals. And building more schools and improving infrastructure of existing schools. And other things they do include boarding schools as well. So a lot of ethnic minority children will sleep over at school in the week at a boarding school and then go home at weekends. And this is to solve issues of children living far away from potential schools. And another that's not up here is also satellite schools. So this is, you might have a school's geographically dispersed, but under one central management. So lessens the burden of needing multiple managers across schools, but it also means children who live in remote areas do get access to schooling. And in terms of improving quality, they do lots of teacher training specifically for teaching ethnic minority groups, particularly understanding local customs and practices that might be different to the Kin majority. They provide a lot of teaching aids to help teaching ethnic minority pupils. Many of these are to do with group work, so they try and encourage the use of group work, particularly because there are a lot of multi-age classrooms, and because of you might have multiple languages within one classroom too. They also provide incentives for teach work in remote areas, so trying to get high quality teachers to go to these rural locations, as you saw with Ha Giang, and teaching children with ethnic minority groups. And finally, there are a multitude of different technologies that are available for these classrooms too. And many of our respondents in Ha Giang did say that previously they were teaching in bamboo structures, and now they're teaching in brick structures, and they have the use of technology and smart boards, and that there's been a lot of investment in the infrastructure of the schools in these areas.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. We were interested to listen to what the interviewees were telling us about the way in which policy is implemented, and I think this is maybe one of the things that Andrea Schleicher was struck by, because the what you could call the middle tier features very prominently in the lives of the school principals. So the school's engagement with the world of policy is mediated by district or provincial level authorities, depending on the age of the children. And these institutions, as I say, feature very prominently in the lives of the principals. And they often use this phrase, the head teachers, to describe this system. They called it the logical system. They talked about how it's both top down and bottom up. So policies will be cascaded and explained, But there's an expectation of a feedback loop that the implementation problems will be rapidly fed up the system. This is the way the principals were describing what it felt like when policies were being implemented. And the pivotal person in the logical system is the principal, who acts as the interface between the school community and the external state authorities. So I think there's some interesting structures. I think there's also an interesting dynamic and culture in that it is very striking in looking at the transcripts of all our discussions, just how lively and frank the professional discourse is in Vietnam. And people are not shy in describing implementation problems. Policy implementation, it seemed to us, is therefore enhanced maybe by this quite lively, frank, professional discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel.
So here they are discussing, these are a group of primary school teachers. We didn't specifically ask about this policy, but what was quite typical in all of our focus groups was that they'd start a lively discussion among themselves about a policy of the time. So all our primary school teachers, when we were conducting our interviews, were talking about qualitative feedback and verbal feedback. And this is just one example of 3 teachers talking about the merits and the pitfalls of using qualitative feedback, so written feedback. So it's more of an example, as Tony was saying, about a lively professional discourse that might be unexpected in settings such as Vietnam, but we saw it persistently throughout all of our field work, and teachers are aware of policies, of policies from 10 years ago, right through to now, and they could still recall what was good or bad about them and the feedback that they gave and how they implemented them.
So, and actually that particular theme of assessment we'll return to in a moment. I mean, it just so happened this is what everybody was talking about when we were doing the field work. I think it is interesting as a policy implementation example. So the government was saying, you know what, we've got to try to get away from our obsession with grades towards more meaningful diagnostic feedback to the students. So that was the message that was coming down from the Ministry of Education, and the teachers were wrestling with this, wrestling with not compliance. They were fundamentally compliant, but how? And the parents don't like it because they like grades. And I've got 50 kids in my class. How can I do this diagnostic work? A really lively debate that wasn't challenging the fundamental desirability of the policy, but was really saying, but how can we make this work? Okay, our second theme is to do with accountability. And for sure, government schools in Vietnam are highly accountable. There are strong systems in place, both inside the schools and externally, that hold to account the work of the professionals. So in terms of external scrutiny, the representatives of what I call the middle tier are constantly monitoring what's happening in the schools. On top of that, there will be formal inspections every so often. We were particularly interested in the internal accountability mechanisms. And again, if you'd look to the Pisa data, you seem to get reinforcement of the significance of internal monitoring. So the principal survey that goes with Pisa, asking principals whether or not observations were used in their schools by senior staff for the purposes of teacher monitoring. Vietnamese response, 99% say yes. OECD countries on average, 82%. Lots of evidence of strong internal monitoring systems. But interestingly, also a combination between the challenge and the support, between the professional development as well as the scrutiny. So again, a PISA statistic, percentage of schools where formal teacher mentoring was in place, 99%, Vietnam, OECD average, 72%. So there seems to be this combination of strong challenge, but also significant support. The principal is pivotal to this. And Rachel, tell us about the principal as in-school inspector.
So a common feature of the interviews or focus groups was, again, the reference to the school principal as being an in-school inspector. Teachers would often talk about principals taking surprise visits to classes to view the teaching and learning, and that they'd always give feedback after those classes too. And what's interesting about this is that none of the teachers mentioned this negatively. And that's not necessarily because teachers won't mention negative things about school principals, because they did with some other things. So it's not necessarily them not wanting to speak badly of the school principal. But it was all very matter of fact in terms of all the accountability measures that were in place. So it was just accepted that on a daily basis, the school principal will come into the classroom and observe teaching and learning. And that they would, as Tony said, get support and feedback as a result of those class visits, which is partly why we think there was more positivity towards these inspections than you might think there would be in a really highly accountable system.
Okay. So in addition to the role of the principal, we were also struck by comments on the role of the subject lead and the subject group. So there are regulations in Vietnamese government schools that require every teacher to be a member of a team, which they call the subject group. And the coordinators, the heads of these teams, appear to us to be really rather important people in the functioning of a Vietnamese school. And they coordinate an almost constant round of peer review. So the teachers are engaged very, very regularly in the observation of the practice of others, coordinated by the head of the subject group. So here's some comments from the front line, if you like, in Vietnam. I am the head of the subject group. Every month we visit classes, assess the teaching quality, and report the results for each teacher to the principal and the vice principal. Here's another teacher. We form an evaluation group, 2 to 3 people, to observe each teacher's lessons and make an evaluation. This approach is applied to all teachers of all subjects at the school. And this phenomenon has been described in passing already by the Young Lives inquiry. And it seems to us to be a very important aspect of the informal professional learning opportunities that you get in a Vietnamese government school, because these conversations are going on constantly on a peer basis, and it's a serious business. Okay, so in terms of quality teaching, our qualitative inquiry did not involve judgments about teaching quality. We haven't been in classrooms measuring the teaching quality. We've been talking to the stakeholders, and we have the strengths and limitations of that methodology. What we do know is that lots of the teachers and principals that we spoke to described very confidently their, if you like, their pedagogical philosophy. And we do know from examining the policies that there has been this very lively debate on the right kind of pedagogy really since the late 1990s, with the government promoting a new, quote, student-centered pedagogy, suggesting that traditional pedagogy gives too passive a role for the students. But at the same time, teachers were telling us repeatedly that on a day-to-day basis, they choose, they make decisions, they make the decisions about the pedagogy. And many of our interviewees, both the principals and the teachers, seem to be describing, if you like, their own negotiated mixed economy, mixed methods approach that drew upon the best, what they saw as the best of traditional and modern techniques. Now, that's possible because, as I said, on a day-to-day basis, the specific teaching techniques are not prescribed. What is required is that the outcomes should be good. So we saw a lot of the reflection of this debate in our interviews with principals and indeed with teachers. Rachel.
So when we talk to teachers about their pedagogical approaches in classrooms, there was a common sense that they knew they were supposed to use student-centered methods, but the way they went about this, they kind of negotiated how they do this in the classroom. So quite a lot of international actors are very pro-student-centered approaches and quite anti-traditional teaching methods. But Vietnamese teachers were telling us, well, you need to use both. And they told us that they do use both and that they've kind of adopted their own flexible, as we call it, mixed economy approach to how they teach their students. So as one teacher in Ha Giang said, as a grade 1 teacher, I need to use grade 1 specific methods. We need to be flexible when it comes to the methods of teaching. And then another teacher in Hang said, in my opinion, for teaching techniques, there is no universal method. And this was in response to the drive for predominantly only using student-centered methods. And again, as we talked about earlier, teaching methods have been part of a very lively debate. And the teachers strongly argued for occasional use of traditional style whole class teaching, in addition to things like group or project work. So that's what we were being told in the interviews. Whether or not that happens in the classroom, we're not sure. Okay.
Great, thanks. We talked before about the debate about assessment, and I think one of the really interesting statistics from the Pisa survey does hint at Vietnamese teachers taking diagnostic assessment and feedback for individual students seriously. So in 2015, the focus was on science, and the students all over the world were asked questions about what it's like, to be studying science in their countries, and they were asked questions about the likelihood of teachers giving them individual guidance, individual feedback on how they could get better at science. And it is striking that the Vietnamese students' response to that question was, if you like, the most positive in the world of all 17 jurisdictions. Only 5% of students in Vietnam agreed with the statement, my science teacher never tells me personally how to improve my performance. And that was the best response in the world. So maybe hinting at that aspect of the debate about teaching styles resonating and beginning maybe to make a difference. And of course, we know from, for example, the work of John Hattie, that this aspect of pedagogy is very powerful. I think it's particularly impressive because although this was the best, if you like, best score in the world, the typical class size in Vietnam was one of the worst of the participating countries. So they've got over 40 kids in front of them versus 20, 25 in Western Europe, and yet they seem to be giving more individualized feedback according to that Pisa data. So, okay, two more themes. Hope you're not flagging. 2 more themes to go. We'll speed up a little bit. We said a lot about leadership already, so we'll talk about that quite quickly. By the way, our online colleagues, maybe you're already sending in observations, questions, cries of horror, or whatever. That fine. Do that so that we can engage once we've finished. Okay, so I think we've made this point already, that the principal is a key figure in the functioning of the school. The Vietnamese models of school are very different from Western models. So school leaders told us how they had become principals, and they hadn't chosen, they hadn't applied. They'd been, somebody had tapped on their shoulder. It's not a career choice. Principals do not typically apply for the role. It's interesting that they get pretty minimalistic financial incentives for being the head teacher. It's a big job for which you get a very, very modest financial reward. And the principals often told us that they were paid less often than their more experienced junior colleagues, because there's a scale, an incremental scale in Vietnam, so that the teachers get paid more the more years of service they've had. So it's quite common for the principal to be paid less than his or her most experienced junior colleagues. Okay, the model is not a kind of high autonomy model. It's not a question of school-based, financial decision making, principals making decisions about hiring and firing. That's not the case. What it is I think a model of instructional leadership, with the principals having this key role we alluded to in terms of the performance management, the quality assurance, the provision of diagnostic feedback to the teachers. So, Rachel.
So we asked head teachers, or school principals, sorry, in Hanoi and Hazang to tell us about a typical day in their schools in terms of what they do in their role. And just to quickly point out that the most interesting feature of this was there was consistency across both provinces about the activities school principals would do in a typical day. And what was particularly interesting is they were the same frequency across the two provinces as well. So highlighted in blue on this slide that 3 times a day, this particular head teacher in Hanoi said that they go into classrooms to check the conduct of teaching and learning activities. So they will do this 3 times in a day. And that was consistent across 2 very distinct provinces. Okay.
Thank you. And so our last theme, and last but I'm sure absolutely not least, the role of the parents. So the regulations, the Ministry of Regulations, give a very prominent role to parents in the life of the school, both in terms of governance issues, but also in terms of their ability to engage with discussions about their own children. And there are some quite interesting structures in a Vietnamese government school, according to the regulation. One of the most interesting from my perspective is the existence of a parent committee at the level of every class group. So every home group of students must, according to the regulations, have a committee of 4 or 5 parents who regularly review what's going on with the children, with the home group teacher. And it's two-way street. It's a communication exercise, it's an accountability exercise, and the communication and the accountability, according to the regulations, are going in both directions. And then representatives of the parent committees sit on the whole school parent board. So some really quite interesting structures. As Rachel said, we with the market research company Ipsos Vietnam, and we talked to 350 parents across our 4 provinces about their experience. They were happy with their local schools. We asked them about how school compared with when they were at school. Has it got better? Well, better almost every level, not just infrastructure, but the quality of what was going on educationally, the quality of the teachers. They were very positive. We asked a question about how often they felt listened to by the school, and of the 350, not one agreed with the statement, "I never feel listened to by the school." So this was pretty impressive. One very interesting distinctive aspect of the Vietnamese context is the so-called policy of socialization. It's a piece of Vietnamese jargon. It describes the fact that unless you're disadvantaged, it is expected that you will make financial or in-kind contributions to the school. It's quite controversial. A lot of experts think that it's some form of privatization, that it could lead to various forms of inequity. We haven't explored the debate. We were just listening to what people had to say, and people said different things about socialization. But it's important, whether you agree with it or not. It's I think an important part of the kind of the financial model of the school. Of our 350 parents, over 80%. Were making contributions through the policy of socialization. Again, checking this against the Pisa data leads you to some interesting conclusions. And again, you get this kind of Vietnamese exceptionalism in terms of the Pisa survey data. Over and over again, the Vietnam response is a real outlier. So principals were asked, what percentage of parents during the previous 12 months discussed their child's progress with the teacher on their own initiative? So come in, all right, not for a parents' consultation meeting. They'd come in. So the Vietnamese percentage was 49%, about half of them, which was the highest in the world. OECD average 27%. What parents do you calculate came in during the last 12 months and volunteered in the school? OECD average 5%. Vietnam response 41%, the highest in the world. I mean, there are some really interesting indicators of quite a lively, practical partnership with the parents, and this is mandated by the regulations.
So in our policy analysis, we looked at policies relating to parental engagement. And what was particularly interesting was that parents in Vietnam have both rights and responsibilities as parents. So in terms of the rights of parents, they mostly relate to rights of involvement in committees or other aspects of their children's education. So they have a right to be involved, and the school has the responsibility to ensure they are involved in their children's education. And that might be quite standard across different countries, maybe not. But what's particularly interesting is that Vietnam also gives parents responsibilities too. So they're responsible for coordinating with the school. They're responsible for making sure they keep in touch with their representative of the parents committee and provide feedback through either the teacher or their representative, but also to take responsibility for their children's mistakes and faults. So if their children aren't doing very well at school, they're not showing up, ultimately the parents are responsible, and this is mandated in policy.
Great. Okay. Well, nearly there. Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. So we've described our themes. Some aspects of this are very distinctive. You know, the role of the subject group, the parent committee, the rights and wrongs of socialization. Very interesting, I think, but also quite distinctive. I think also that for me, there's a resonance between the promising practices and the wider, if you like, global discourse about emerging themes when it comes to improving government schools worldwide. So surely it's highly desirable that policymakers should avoid chopping and changing lots of different initiatives that sap energy from the system through frequent changes of direction. And that's something I think you see in aspects of the Vietnamese story. Surely educational professionals need both challenge and support. They need scrutiny, they need incentives, they need professional development, they need that mix of challenge and support. And that theme of challenge plus support comes through from our transcripts. There's an interesting debate going on in Vietnam about a repertory of pedagogical techniques. And I think maybe we're getting to a more mature position when we're seeing pedagogy in less binary terms, you know, the bad teacher-centered teacher and the good student-centered teacher. Maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. Maybe it's a question of fitness for purpose. And that maturity was certainly reflected in what the principals and the teachers were saying to us. We didn't observe their practice, but in terms of their descriptions. And we were hearing about school principals with a focus on teaching. One of the regulations actually mandates you as a principal to teach. You must teach if you're a principal, so that you're a teacher, you're a leader of teachers, you're an instructional leader. And then again, for me, surely the parental dimension is important. And if schools can harness the power of parental partnership, surely they can greatly enhance the chances of improved learning outcomes. Okay, so thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The report is free to download on our website, and we look forward to your questions and observations.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very clear, very instructive, challenging too also for policymakers in the world. And maybe before I open the floor, I have one of the questions, what you really clearly discuss but also point out is that it's not only one policy that made or seemed to have made the difference, but a set of 5 different policies that you group into these themes that you have. But maybe one of the questions here too is, how does the government here in Vietnam succeeds to put together policies and implement them in a way where actors are aligned and they put the right inputs, I would say, or make the right decisions in a probably sequenced order? Because in the report you discuss about the fact that there has been, before all these increase in quality and the improvement in quality, Vietnam also invested a lot in infrastructure, but also never considered infrastructure as being the only way really to, or the only investment that was needed. So all the actors were aligned, all the decisions were made in a way at the same time, but also delivered in the same way, in a sequenced way. So the question is, how do you, it's kind of a panacea, but a real question, how do you put that all together? Because if you take the 5 pieces and you read a lot of meta-analysis, of impact evaluation, you will find all these pieces. But one of the questions is, how do you put all that together? So one of the hints you give is be consistent and persistent. But also there is something probably about the way you deliver. It's the logical system. And how do you see the fact that these governments succeeded not only in making the right choice of these 5 blocks probably, but also putting all that together in a way that works, where in other countries, in a lot of other countries, not only governments cannot make, in a sense, I exaggerate, let's say, but the right decisions, but cannot put blocks together. That's it. And maybe you want to take a bunch of questions together. So I will open the floor to the room first, and then we'll go to our online audience, okay? So whoever, yeah, Anton.
Okay, thanks. I thought that indeed. My name is Anton de Grauwe. I thought it very, very interesting. And I have a few comments, if you allow me, Hugo. The first one is, I did some work together with a number of colleagues about 10 years ago on Vietnam, looking at the effectiveness of the educational administration. Because Vietnam was considered to be a relatively effective educational administration compared to many other administrations. And one of the conclusions we arrived at was that the administration is effective partly because of the strong accountability, and an accountability which was actually double. There was an accountability within the administration, this school to district education office to provincial to ministry, and an accountability at each level to the party, the political party, which was strongly represented. One conclusion would be that every country should set up a strong communist party, but we didn't go that far. But the issue at that time was that this accountability was working well because it was imposing a number of rules and regulations which were obediently followed by the different actors, and as a result had allowed Vietnam to make good progress, especially related to access. The question though was, if the challenge becomes quality, where you need actually more autonomy and more thinking at local level, if that accountability was not constraining more than allowing that autonomy. And I thought it very interesting that you showed to some extent that problem was solved, maybe by focusing more on the teacher level, by making sure that there was teacher professionalism, and that the whole question of decentralization, centralization, and so on maybe becomes less important once we succeed really to change the teachers. That was the first comment. The second one is a question. I have a third one, but I'll drop it. The second one is a question. This issue of principals, yes, we know principals are important. How does it work with small schools, where probably the principals may not have the competence, the legitimacy, authority, the background, and so on that they have in bigger schools? There used to be a system of satellite schools, and if that still exists, it would be good also to get a comment on that.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll take a third question and then... Sure. Yes, Pablo. so far I know everybody, but
Hi, Pablo Martin. I work here as an intern. I have one question regarding teachers training. Since you said that they have a very informed discourse when they talk about their practice, their methods, their teaching methods, and I'd like to know if you have any data about how is their pre-service training and in-service training besides the mentoring techniques that they have in place. Thanks.
Okay. Shall I go first?
Yeah, go.
Right. Great questions. So going back to Hugh, I think there's a danger, isn't there, when we're thinking about the effectiveness of particular interventions to look at things, in a box, and actually. Some approaches to evaluation almost encourage you to do that. If you want to think about something like experimentally, then you need to get rid of other variables, don't you? And I understand all that, and I don't want to have a big debate about RCTs. But I think what is interesting about Vietnam is the sense of the interconnection. So that if you think like the massive investment in infrastructure, you can't sort of assess or evaluate that in a box, because it came, as far as I can see it, as part of in fact, a kind of social contract with the teachers. You know what? We're going to give you better facilities, and you know what? You're going to teach differently, and the two things connect. So I think this theme of alignment is extremely important. And in a way, you answered the question yourself with reference to the logical system, because that's for sure. The what we were seeing from the transcripts, that the policies were set. Yes, as Anton says, it's a communist state, and I'll return to his questions. The policies were set. The debate wasn't about whether the policy was a good idea. The debate was about how, and that's where the top-down, bottom-up conversation was taking place. In terms of Anton's questions, he's absolutely right. It remains the case, and we didn't have time to go into all the ins and outs, but the party is very powerful in accountability terms. And there is a political board for each school. And you've got this dual accountability in terms of the external scrutiny between the representatives of the district or the provincial bureau, and the representatives of the different organs of the Communist Party. But what we were hearing about wasn't to do with a kind of discourse of obedience. That wasn't what we were hearing about. And actually, government has been quite, for want of a better word, provocative in terms of trying to create a real debate about education and quality. One phrase that keeps coming up over and over again in the transcripts is this reference to something in Vietnam they call the achievement disease, or the achievement obsession. And this phrase comes from the government. And the government is saying, are we kidding ourselves? We're pursuing grades all the time. We have these excellent teacher competitions. At times, people do various forms of gaming because of our preoccupation with scores and numbers, etc. And we've got to challenge that. So it's not a question of obedience. And I think the key question about whether or not the teachers were obliged to follow particular mandated pedagogies is at the heart of this. And this is not what they were telling us. Rachael.
Yeah, well, I think probably answer the first two questions in one, both in relation to policy implementation and the communist one-party state issue. When you read the policies and analyse them, you notice that they start by setting out the problem, not in a political sense. They don't seem politically driven or motivated. It's very much oriented to, this is where the current gap is. This is where the improvement need to take place. And then these are the kind of, they are logical. I mean, the school principals called them logical. And And in our analysis, prior to even doing the interviews, we'd have called them logical too, because the approach to solving these problems are just very much rational, non-political ways of going about closing the gap particularly between disadvantaged groups and their peers in learning outcomes. So I think that's one thing. The policies are very problem-solving, solutions-oriented, and not particularly political. And in terms of the accountability system being linked to the Communist Party, I think that is definitely true, but there's also a sense of mutually dependent accountability. So everyone's in this accountability system, from parents right up to the ministry, and everyone has both rights and responsibilities within that system. And everyone has the right to say, you're not doing your job properly, or you're not doing your job properly. And it's almost created a mutually reinforcing environment where everyone knows their role in the accountability system. And of course, it's impossible to say whether that would exist without the communist state. But we did see, I'm sure you could probably create a similar system without the communist state that's just about mutually reinforcing accountability.
The small school question is an interesting one. We didn't have a chance to go out and do a sort of comprehensive analysis of that topic, but what we got from the experts that we were talking to in Hanoi was a strong sense that, it's pretty complex out there, that there's a greater diversity of practice than you would conclude simply by reading the policy documentation. Having said that, we were talking to folks in, deliberately, radically contrasting provinces, and the discourse was really quite similar. But experts were saying to us, for example, in terms of the role of the parents, there'll be some communities where there is just a different kind of power dynamic, and that whatever it says in the regulations, it will be very difficult for the parents to have the kind of voice that for sure the ministry in Hanoi wants them to have, and that's definitely part of the theory. Just a final reflection on the communist dimension. I don't want to pontificate about Vietnamese communism, but there's a kind of communitarian feel to a lot of the discourse, as well as messages from Hanoi. A sense that communes should be making decisions, and that people should have a voice at the that you might not always associate with that political governance. We haven't answered the question about pre-service training. We didn't look a great deal at pre-service training, although we interviewed quite a few pre-service trainers, Rachael, didn't we?
Yeah, so we know that the pre-service standards, what was required to become a teacher was increased from 2008 onwards, and then again in 2012. So before that point, you could have just attended high school and then gone on to be a teacher. But from 2012 onwards, you'd need to have attained a university degree. And there are actually different requirements for different levels of education. So the older the children you teach, the more time at university you'll need to have spent teacher training. So the upper secondary, you find that many of the teachers have master's degrees that are subject specific for what they're teaching. And as Tony said, we didn't go into depth into that. That was just one of the things that we found. And actually in the report, it does give, I'm sorry, I can't remember the page number, but we do have the grid that shows the pre-service training requirements for different stages of the education level.
And the satellite schools still exist, don't they?
And one of the groups of schools in our sample in Hazang was part of the satellite school. So for those unsure of what they are, that's schools that are spread geographically. So they might be multiple classrooms across different parts in a region, but they're kind of centrally administered. And the purpose of these is particularly in rural areas, so children don't have to travel too far to get to school. And they also lessen the administrative burden by having lots of head teachers for very small schools, so that they can just have one administrative system across multiple classrooms.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll turn to our online audience. If you have some questions, I'm sure you do.
So first question from West Africa. Why if Vietnam has such a good education system, is it still so poor? Why doesn't it translate into more income for more people? A second question, a comment from Glasgow in Scotland on why teachers might continue to use traditional methods. Perhaps it's to do with a weak infrastructure to employ more modern methods, perhaps the long existing use of traditional methods, and perhaps also high pupil-teacher ratios. What do you think?
Okay.
Well,
Is that, I've got more?
give us
Yeah,
one more.
Okay, so another one, I'm not sure where in the world this one comes from yet. If the school principal is so central to the system and can have fewer years of experience than the teachers, could you please say a bit more about the criteria to become a school principal?
Great. So should we do it the same way?
Yeah,
Rachel?
you go.
Yeah. Why is Vietnam still so poor? Well, actually, Vietnam has grown spectacularly in its national income since the 1990s. And technically, well, not technically, it is no longer officially a low-income country. It's a middle-income country. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. It is no longer one of the poorest countries in the world. We had something of a debate with our colleagues in the Vietnam Institute of Educational Sciences about this topic. I said at the beginning, we can't prove the causation, and you can't prove the fact that Vietnam has the connection between the fact that Vietnam appears to have an impressive basic education system and its economic performance. But it seems to be highly likely that there is a connection between these two facts. I think also, though, it's typical of the Vietnamese colleagues that they won't rest on their laurels. They are preoccupied with the economic imperative, and they will say, yes, our children are good at taking tests, but how good are they, in the workplace, solving real economic problems? And I think that's a sort of tribute to the sort of ambition, but also the modesty of the Vietnamese colleagues. Traditional methods and science. We based on our qualitative inquiry, were able to come up with a definitive view of the traditional methods versus the more modern methods. Personally, this is my opinion, I think the comments that the Vietnamese colleagues were making seem to me to be very mature, not commenting on the need to maybe retain old-fashioned methods simply because we didn't have the right resources or whatever, but because there were some merits to the right kind of interactive, challenging whole-class teaching, just as there are merits to group work and inquiry. So we don't make a judgment about that. And there may well be some other factors at work here, as our colleague from Glasgow commented. So what was the third question?
About school principals and their experience.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about all of that, but particularly the last point, Rachel?
Okay. Yeah, I'll go to the teaching methods first. So in terms of why teachers said that they'd use traditional methods over things like group work or project work, as Tony said, there were often very logical reasons for doing so, other than stubbornness, or that's the only thing that they knew how to do. And it's also important to note, actually, that primary school and lower secondary school in Vietnam, they no longer have high stakes examinations at the end of the school period. So when students leave primary school to go on secondary school, there is no longer a high stakes exam, and the same for the end of lower secondary education. So in terms of one of the reasoning that's often used for why teachers use traditional methods, it's because it's towards exams. That's not necessarily the case anymore with Vietnam. And in terms of teachers' knowledge of new approaches, they did tell us about trying to implement things like group work and when they thought it worked and when they thought it didn't. So actually all the teachers spoke to us about group work in particular did comment that they didn't think it was good in all multilingual classrooms because some of the weaker students get lost, that they can't always see when there's a class of 60. So whoever was commenting in Glasgow did mention class size. So if there's a class of 60 children, it's really difficult to see that all children are on task if it's group work, whereas if it's a whole class teaching approach, they're able to see that all children are interacting with them and are getting on with the work. So they were just some of the reasons that were mentioned to us. In terms of why school principals were selected if they weren't necessarily the most experienced teachers. So some school principals said to us it was based on their evaluations as teachers. So they might have had consistently good evaluations in their classes, bearing in mind that district officials come in and observe teachers in addition to school living teachers. School principals from other schools come in and observe teachers. So teachers are observed by lots of different groups in Vietnam. So that was one of the reasons. But another one of the reasons that is perhaps more controversial that does link to communism is perhaps that they were kind of good at reporting back to the Communist Party on the school board, say. So they had a good relationship with the Communist Committee linked to the school. So there are some political reasons that come into the reason why school principals are head teachers, but it's also partly merit driven too.
I think that Rachel's absolutely right there. You get a strong sense that the principals are tapped on the shoulder because they are trusted, the authorities trust them, but also because they do have a reputation for being particularly effective teachers. And the Young Lives data, some recent Young Lives data suggests that typically that you can win this award as an excellent teacher in Vietnam. Typically the head teachers have achieved this particular commendation. I mean, just a final thought on the traditional methods. Again, we within our study haven't had a chance to fully explore this, but there is an interesting relationship between the view of the methods and the parental voice. And certainly in recent years, there's been a lot of debate in the media, for example, about particular approaches. And there are examples where actually parents have clearly articulated, if you like, a rather more conservative view of pedagogy. And that maybe that also has helped to sort of shape the debate about traditional versus more progressive teaching methods.
Thank you. Yeah, Miyoko and Amelie will take another bunch, right, of questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the responses already. I'm Miyoko, working at the IIP. About 10 years ago, I also looked at several of the policy and planning documents, including that of Vietnam. And what was interesting was that while it was way before SDG and nobody was actually trying to focus on the learning aspect when we talk about the quality of education, I was actually looking after how each country was defining of education. And Vietnam was actually focusing on something, the way school would prepare the students for the world work, which is something similar to what Pisa is using as their test framework, not like the TIMSS and PEARLS. That is also echoed, interestingly, that Vietnam has participated only in Pisa, but not in TIMSS and PEARLS, I guess, for the international assessment. And you also just mentioned that that is also echoed in the fact that there are no high-stake examinations. So basically what they have been doing is to to prepare the student, the schools to prepare the students so that they will be able to apply what they learned in school, which is forward-looking, and rather than to evaluate against the school curriculum. And so my question is whether you were able to see something related to that from, talking with the students, not students or the teachers or the principals, about the way they interpret this notion of quality of education, or maybe in the criteria that are used in the school, not the supervisor, the inspectors that would come to inspect the teacher's teaching.
Amélie, and then we'll have other questions online.
Thank you. Amélie from Technical Corporation here at IIP. I was curious to hear a bit more about private. Mentioned that probably a high proportion of students do have access to private tutoring. A parallel system that a famous IIP publication named the shadow system. Yes. And I understand also that there were no econometric model to isolate the impact of private tutoring on other findings. So I was just curious to know if you had more information, for example, how much money families would spend on private tutoring, or how many hours of private tutoring children have access to, just to get a bit of, estimation on the potential impact of private tutoring. Mm-hmm.
Another question from Glasgow. Could you say a bit more about the logical system? Is there any evidence about how practitioners' feedback is received and helps to formulate, implement, and policies at the top? Mm-hmm. And also, from Myanmar, could you say a bit more about how the promising practices developed? So, for example, what made possible the move from teacher-centered pedagogy to a mixed economy, and over what time period?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. The connection with the world of work debate is absolutely rock solid. You are 100% correct, and if you, as you did yourself, if you look back at the policies, there is an economic imperative behind this, and it's I talked a moment ago about the economic imperative that leads senior officials to be skeptical of tests, and to promote this idea of the achievement disease. And you've got, if you like, a kind of before fake news that there are the government has been consistently saying, we want some deep changes round here. We want some deep changes. I think it is interesting to see the way they explicitly benchmarked the system against highly successful economic jurisdictions, because for sure they did that, and there are aspects of the reform process where you can see that the Vietnamese government has said, no, we've got to benchmark ourselves against the best in the world. I think it also reflects this connection with the world of work. There's a sort of rejection of, Michael Barber with McKinsey used to say, you've got to take these little steps in order to get to transformation. I don't read that into the Vietnamese policy context. So, for example, in the Ho Chi Minh city transcripts, people are talking there. The debate is about the right kind of IT in the classroom for our kids, what the third modern language should be, the third modern language should be. And it's all clearly within the context of this, commitment to this transformed Vietnamese economy. I hadn't thought about what you said till just now about Pisa versus TIMSS, but that would make perfect sense to me. The logic, so private tutoring. What do we know about private tutoring? Well, we haven't done an investigation of it. It's there. It's clearly there. Our sample of parents were probably a little bit advantaged compared to the majority, but over 80% of those parents were paying for private tuition. There are regulations, which Rachel's referenced in the book, about the control of private tuition. And there's a particular regulation that says it is absolutely forbidden for you to teach of an evening a student, an individual, a real student that you would teach during the day. So there are regulations. One thing that intrigued me, which we don't make much of in the report because we didn't have the evidence to do that, is what the relationship is between private tutoring and the retention of the teachers. Because something else that we haven't said much about this afternoon is that the teachers told us repeatedly how terribly badly paid they were. Okay, so on prom we were told over and over again, you do realize how badly paid we are. And there'll be a teacher who'll say, I've got a master's degree and I could be paid more if I was working on a forecourt selling petrol. So they're badly paid. Teaching is very respected in Vietnamese society. A question I have is, well, why do you stick around if you're so badly paid? And maybe that's a cynical question. Maybe they stick around because they're idealistic people, patriotic people. But maybe the fact that there is a significant way of supplementing your income helps to keep some talented people within the system. Now that's just a thought. That's not like a major a theme in the report. Rachel, do you want to come in on either of those points before we take the
Yeah, so not so much looking at preparing students for the world of work, but the question on quality and what quality looks like in education now. Many of the policies that when inspectors go into classrooms, whoever that is, what they're looking for is students enjoying and engaging in the lesson. So many of the policies, whether it's about the inspection framework or the teacher pedagogical approaches they should use, it all centers around student enjoyment of learning. And so one of our questions that we asked teachers was, what does a kind of ideal perfect lesson look like? Or can you give us an example of a lesson you taught recently that you would consider excellent, high quality education? And all of them, when they were picking excellent lessons, they were constantly referencing the students' reactions to what they were teaching. And that was what they were considering high quality to be. And actually, in terms of forward looking in preparing for work and soft skills, many teachers and school principals were quite negative, saying that they're not quite there yet and that actually students lack soft skills. But again, that's very subjective. And it comes under what Tony was saying earlier about a constant push that we're not yet there yet. So we saw evidence that they have progressed in that area of soft skills, but it wasn't enough for the respondents we were talking to. And in terms of private tutoring, there are lots of, I can't get them off the top of my head, but I know there are lots of figures online that some parents will spend on a yearly basis in excess of, say, $2,000 on private tutoring. And if you think the GDP per capita in Vietnam is $2,000. So although they'll be the more affluent parents, it just gives you a thought about exactly how prevalent it is and how much people are willing to pay. And we did ask parents what subjects that they paid for private tutoring in, and it was always the core subjects. So all parents would say English, science, maths, and occasionally Vietnamese too. So, but I can get figures later to you if you like about the amount that parents spend.
In terms of the questions online, the logical system in action.
Yeah.
We saw a couple of instances, if you like, of the feedback loop in action. So for example, there's been quite a big project based on the Colombian Escuela Nueva model, which is very well regarded. It's used in many countries, and it has been sort of smiled upon by the Vietnamese government, and they did a pilot of it. I think it'd be fair to say that the feedback they got varied from province to province, and that in some provinces, teachers and parents were more or less happy with the principles of this Vietnamese version, VNEN, to such an extent that the government said, okay, well, it's up to you then. So at provincial level, you decide whether you want to build on the investment we've made in the pilot, whether you want to adapt it, whether you want to abandon it. And I think all those three things have happened in different provinces as part of as a result of the feedback through, if you like, the logical system. We talked to colleagues in Hanoi, for example, an expert on ethnic minority students, who gave us a kind of vignette of how, for example, curriculum changes would be modified based on the feedback from the front line to make sure that they were in keeping with the needs of the children whose first language wasn't Vietnamese. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and particularly, I got the sense, or we got the sense from the field work, that it's particularly the case with ethnic minority groups. They're aware, they're trying to push for quality education for all, and they're aware that ethnic minority groups are lagging behind in performance for multiple reasons. So they're very responsive to when policies aren't working, to see why they're not working on the ground, look at the data, liaise with the Vietnam Institute of Educational Sciences lead on ethnic minorities, and then adapt the policies accordingly. And you can see a pattern of this. So when you look at the sequence of policies from the past 20 years, and you look at the amount of policies in place to try and improve quality and access of education for ethnic minority groups, there is this strong sense that they're being adapted to meet what they've identified as a problem from evidence that they've collected. So I think they are particularly responsive in that area, as Tony said.
And in terms of the question from our colleague in Myanmar, I think that where did these promising practices come from? We talked about the consistency and the sustained approach. I mean, for sure, it goes back to the late 1990s in terms of particular aspects of policy which are still being emphasized. And I think it was Yoko's point that the Vietnamese colleagues were, if you like, they were talking about the SDGs before the SDGs. They were talking about the need for the issues that would determine quality way back in the late 90s. So maybe before the Millennium Development Goals.
So I think they were also specifically asking about the mixed economy and how that was made possible. So that particular policy. And I think it was so Vietnam are very outward looking, and many of the policies, such as the current teaching standards, they've been developed by looking at other high performing education systems. And I think that's the thing with Vietnam. They benchmark themselves not against economies that are similar to themselves, but against high income economies. And that's always been their goal and their benchmark. And that's what they've been aiming towards for the past 20, 25 years. So particularly with the pedagogical approaches in this mixed economy, I think the way they go about taking best practice from other high income countries and implementing them, they're very good at contextualizing them, so making sure that they are context specific. And teachers play a big role in this by almost like negotiate when policies come down. So you've got to do more group work. Well, they'll respond to that by kind of negotiating exactly what that looks like in their classroom. So they won't say, no, we're not doing group work. But their response is, well, we still need traditional methods. So we've created our own mixed economy approach. And initially, when we were reading the transcripts, we thought that this might have been a policy directive, this mixed economy. But then we realized actually it's just teachers' response to being told to use more student-centered practices.
Yeah, but that's exactly what happened. We after the first round of field work, we thought, there's some sort of policy here about you must choose the best of the traditional and the best of the modern. So we went back in the second round of fieldwork and asked, is this the case? And the teachers said no. The policy is we must focus on new, engaging, student-centered approaches, but we have a degree of autonomy. We are able to choose on any given day our teaching methods, and we choose to select the best of the traditional and the best of the new.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Is there any other question from the room? If not, there are other questions from online audience. Yeah.
Just two questions. How much do parents contribute? And the second question from India, can you say anything about the average school size and whether every school has a principal? The question, I think, is inspired by the idea that perhaps to achieve universal enrollment, Vietnam has created many, many small schools, in which case to have a principal in every school would be quite an achievement. Is that the case? And if so, how did they do it?
Yeah, I think with the latter, I think I can't give you numbers, but there's a huge variation between very large urban schools and tiny multi-grade classrooms. I think one thing that is interesting is this idea of the satellite schools. So the multi-grade satellite, which is part of a family, which has an overarching principle.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's predominantly in rural areas. And it's quite difficult to say average school size. I mean, Vietnam's a very big country. It's got a huge population, so it's not uncommon to have a school with 1,000 pupils, just as much as it's not uncommon for a school to be part of a satellite school and have 60 pupils. So it's quite difficult to give an average number. I don't know if you want to mention about parents' contribution.
Yeah, our little sample of 350 parents, we asked them that question, and there was a huge range. How does that compare in US dollars?
So anywhere between between $30 and $40 a year, up to say $200 or so a year, in voluntary contributions.
From our little sample, which
Yeah.
we're not saying was absolutely representative, and we think it was quite advantaged actually in national terms.
But again, we also know from our focus groups that in particularly deprived areas, it's not uncommon for parents to not give a monetary contribution, but to contribute to the school in other ways. So particularly in Ha Giang, when we spoke to some parents contribute via socialization by helping build walls or fix things in the classrooms, or if they've got if parents have got any other resource or work for factories and that kind of thing, then they might be able to contribute things like fans or reading materials or writing materials. So it's not all monetary contributions. There are lots of other in-kind contributions and time and energy contributions that are part of this policy too.
Yeah, I will have two questions maybe to look forward a little bit, both on the policy content of your research and on the research process itself. So the first one is, if we go back to the title, which is very cautious and promising practice, what would you see as kind of either tensions or limitations in these policy decision, and also in the trend of Vietnam towards a really highly internationally recognized education system, and what would be the risks over the system, because it's still a system that is expanding, because we see that upper secondary is not at 100% of enrollment. So yeah, what are the possible tensions that you already see? And the second thing would be you really put together these five policy bricks, and what would you say, or what would you like? What would you advise to further investigate into this system? So I guess because it's like based on 4 different geographies that maybe you would like to investigate on a larger scale, but also in all these policy decisions and maybe things that you haven't really had time or not in your initial project. For example, I'm thinking the political economy of different actors, where there are kind of rents, where there are maybe resistances and so on. What would you suggest and advise to continue in terms of research and research questions?
I mean, if I can have a first go at that, I think actually I could answer the 2 questions simultaneously, in that I think one of the problems, and with it, the risks with Vietnam, is that we still don't understand enough about the causation, about the good things that appear to be driving these good outcomes. We don't understand it well enough, and therefore there's got to be a danger, if we don't understand it, that we may end up dismantling aspects of the success story. So we need to better understand what is happening, and we within this qualitative investigation can only take that so far. So I think that an inquiry such as ours has some merit, enabling some of the actors to articulate their perception. I think is really important, but it needs to be verified. So, for example, we've talked a lot this afternoon about the teaching and learning styles. I would like to know a lot more, actually, from observation of typical representative classrooms in Vietnam as to what is really happening. So I think we've maybe teed up some interesting further research inquiries. As you say, we've looked at 4 provinces. There are 63 provinces in Vietnam. We talked to, Vietnam's a big country. How representative were the parents we were talking to? There's much more to be done in that regard. But what actually happens in the typical classroom? And you know what? The Vietnamese people told us very different things. The Vietnamese people did. The Vietnamese experts told us very different things. And so I think there's a lot more research that could be done around that particular topic. Rachel, what do you think?
I think definitely in terms of classroom observation, but also the point earlier that Tony made about the connection between teachers staying on in their roles and private tutoring. So I think the causation there will probably impossible. In terms of investigating that further, that might be one of the key factors that keep quality teachers in schools, which is a big contributing factor to children doing well in examinations such as Pisa. So that would be a particularly interesting one to investigate further.
And I guess also in similar fashion, understanding a little bit more about socialization. So there is a literature about this socialization, kind of expert literature, some of it Vietnamese, some of it international. It's quite negative. A lot of people have written about socialization, describing it as a kind of crisis measure that was needed in the bad times because we didn't have enough tax revenue. And our inquiry only went so far there. What we were hearing from, again, our modest sample of parents was that most of them were content with socialization because it meant that their children's learning environment was improved and they were prepared to pay that particular price. Well, how typical is that, I wonder? And is it possible to posit that socialization is a way of kind of mobilizing sort of pressure for quality, that literally the parents think we are stakeholders in this enterprise, we have high expectations, and that they therefore inject a further element of expectation into the dynamic between service users and the professionals. I think that's a really interesting topic that we couldn't begin to explore in our work so far.
Yes, Miyoko.
Thank you. Something that we didn't hear from your presentation is what are the gender proportion, or whenever you say socialization by parents, or those who those parents are doing this, that, and that, or thinking this, that, and are those the mothers basically? What about the teachers? What kind of the sample? And then also in the population in Vietnam. I mean, I'm sure we can go back to this, read about it, but can you just tell us the principles? Are they mainly men?
Well, we actually had in our sample a gender balance. So there was an even mix of female and male school principals, and there was the same with the teachers as well. So it's difficult to say from our particular sample about the how far that's representative. But we can also say in terms of performance that girls actually tend to do a little bit better than boys, particularly in Pisa. And they do, and enrollment levels. So if we look at gender enrollment levels for primary education, well, it's pretty much universal. But girls actually have better enrollment and lower dropout rates in lower secondary and upper secondary. So that's actually swung 20, 30 years ago when there might be less girls in school. But now we've actually seen more of a shift to girls staying in school longer than boys. And there's a higher dropout rate among boys in Vietnam. So I can only talk from our sample. But I know, again, there is ministry official statistics about the proportion of male and female teachers and principals, but I don't have them on the top of my head, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Do we have maybe just a final question, or if not, we can, I think there is a cocktail over there. We didn't have translators, right? I can see, so I won't thank them, but I would like to thank all of you really for this report. Thank EDT, thank Rachael and Tony. This is a great report, also probably a way forward in going into more details of what happens there, and maybe an opportunity for collaboration. I hope so. With some of you, we will continue working in the 2 upcoming days on another topic, Teachers for Refugees. So thank you very much. And you're invited upstairs. I'm not sure where, but I'm sure in the lobby over there. Thank you so much.